There's a moment in every relationship with a narcissist that nobody warns you about. It's not the moment they hurt you the most, it's the moment they realise they can't control you anymore. And that moment changes them, instantly, predictably, almost like a switch flips. If you've ever set a boundary, walked away, or simply stopped reacting the way you used to, and suddenly the person in front of you felt like someone you'd never met before, that wasn't your imagination. That was a narcissist losing power. And what happens next follows a pattern so consistent, psychologists can practically predict it. I'm going to walk you through exactly what that looks like, so the next time it happens to you, you're not confused, you're prepared. To understand this moment, you have to understand what power actually means to a narcissist. For most people, a relationship is about connection. For a narcissist, a relationship is often, underneath everything, about control. Control over how they're perceived, control over your reactions, control over the narrative of who's right and who's wrong. As long as that control is intact, things can look calm, even charming. But the moment it's threatened, the moment you stop reacting, stop explaining yourself, stop needing their approval, something underneath the surface breaks. Not because they've lost you, because they've lost control of you. And to a narcissist, those are almost the same thing. The first thing that often happens is an intensity spike. Arguments that used to stay at a low simmer suddenly boil over. Accusations get bigger. The stakes of every conversation seem to raise overnight. This isn't random anger, it's an attempt to re-establish control through sheer force, because the quieter tactics, guilt, charm, subtle manipulation, just stopped working on you. When the usual tools fail, some narcissists escalate to the loudest tool they have left. If you've ever thought, this is so much worse than before and I don't even know what changed is you. You stopped being predictable, and unpredictability, to someone who needs control, feels like an emergency. On the opposite end, some narcissists respond to lost power, not with anger, but with an intense return of charm. The same warmth, attention, and affection you remember from the very beginning. This isn't a change of heart, it's a recalibration. If force doesn't work, seduction might. This is often the moment people describe as most confusing, because it can feel like proof the person really does care, right when you needed evidence they didn't. The tell is timing. If the charm shows up specifically after you set a boundary, after you gain distance, after you stop chasing them, it's not coincidence. It's strategy, even if it isn't fully conscious. This is often the most painful, because it doesn't happen in front of you, it happens around you. Once a narcissist senses they can no longer control the story directly, they often start controlling it indirectly through other people. Friends hear a different version of events. Family gets a carefully edited account. Suddenly you're fielding questions, or worse, cold shoulders, from people who don't know what actually happened. The purpose isn't really to convince everyone. It's to make sure that if you ever do tell your side, it lands on an audience that's already been primed to doubt you. This is one of the clearest signs someone has lost direct control over you. They're working to control the narrative instead. This one catches even people who've done years of work on themselves. At the exact moment you're finally standing firm, some narcissists collapse into visible vulnerability. Tears, talk of struggling, sometimes even references to self-harm or crisis. And because most people who end up in these relationships are deeply empathetic, this tactic works far more often than it should. I want to be careful here. Genuine crises are real, and they deserve real care. But if vulnerability reliably appears at the exact moment your boundary threatens their control, and reliably disappears once the boundary softens, that pattern itself is information. Noticing the pattern doesn't mean you stop caring about people. It means you stop mistaking a pattern for a coincidence. None of these four responses are random. They're what psychologists sometimes describe as extinction burst behavior, a term borrowed from behavioral psychology. When a behavior that used to get a reliable response, your compliance, your reaction, your attention, suddenly stops working, the response often intensifies dramatically before it fades. It's the same pattern you'd see in almost any learned behavior that stops being reinforced. A burst of intensity, right before it either escalates further or finally extinguishes. Understanding this doesn't make it painless, but it does make it predictable. And predictable is powerful because it means you can recognize the pattern in real time instead of being blindsided by it. If you're in the middle of this right now, if you've set a boundary and things have suddenly gotten louder, or suspiciously sweeter, or strangely public, I want you to hear this clearly. This isn't proof you made the wrong choice. It's often proof of the opposite. The intensity you're facing is a direct response to the fact that your boundary is working. Calm, controlled people don't escalate when nothing is actually changing. Something is changing. That something is you. The instinct in this moment is often to explain yourself further, to prove your position, to make them understand. Resist that instinct. None of these 4 reactions are actually about understanding. They're about regaining control, and you cannot out-explain a control response. You can only outweight it. The most protective thing you can do in this window is document what's happening. Not for them, but for yourself, so that later, when the confusion sets in, you have something concrete to look back on. The second is limiting how much information reaches them about your reactions. The less feedback they get about whether their tactic is working, the faster the intensity tends to fade. This is directly connected to the extinction burst pattern we just talked about. And the third, the hardest one, allow yourself to feel the discomfort of this stage without reversing course to relieve it. This period is often temporary, but it is also almost always the period that determines whether the boundary holds long-term or quietly erodes. If you're going through this right now, I want you to know what you're experiencing has a name, a pattern, and an endpoint. You are not imagining the intensity, and you are not the reason it's happening. You held a boundary. This is simply what that boundary looks like from the other side. It gets quieter. It does, but usually only after it gets loud first. If this described what you're living through right now, tell me in the comments. I read everyone. And this community has helped a lot of people feel less alone in exactly this moment. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because next week I'm covering the smear campaign in full depth, how to recognize it early, and what to do when people around you have already been told a version of events that isn't true.